The moment I realized my own son had been stealing from me was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no broken glass or slammed doors. It happened quietly in the soft glow of my kitchen light, while I was staring at a credit card statement and trying to understand how groceries could possibly cost $6,000 in a single month. I remember sitting there at my oak dining table, the one my late husband Harold built with his own hands 40 years ago, tracing the line of unfamiliar transactions with my finger. Luxury hotel, high-end jewelry boutique, airline tickets, a private car service in Manhattan. None of it made sense because I hadn't been to New York in over 15 years. And that was the first moment the thought slipped into my mind, cold and sharp. Someone was using my accounts. Someone who knew exactly how to access them. Someone I trusted. I didn't want to think it, but I already knew the answer before I even finished reviewing the statement. My son, Daniel Carter, was the only person with authorized access to my financial accounts. I had given it to him myself 5 years earlier after Harold passed away. Back then, I believed it was the responsible thing to do. I was 62, newly widowed, and Daniel had insisted he wanted to help manage things. He said it with that same reassuring tone he'd used since childhood, the one that made you believe everything was under control. And for years, I trusted him completely, which is why it took me so long to notice what had been happening. At first, the charges were small, subtle, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, easily disguised as routine expenses. But over time, they grew larger, bolder, until they became impossible to ignore. As I sat there that night, the realization spread through me like ice in my veins. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't identity theft. It was betrayal. And it was coming from inside my own family. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a place where something fragile had just shattered. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid of what I might discover next. Because if Daniel had been taking money without telling me, then the question wasn't just how much. It was why. And the answer to that question would change everything. But before I tell you what I found, you need to understand how we got here. Because this story doesn't begin with missing money. It begins with love, with trust, and with a decision I made years ago that I believed was protecting my family. My name is Margaret Louise Carter. I am 67 years old, and until recently, I believed the worst betrayal a woman could face was losing her husband. I was wrong, because sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people you raised with your own hands. The next morning, I called the bank, not to report fraud, not yet. Instead, I asked a simple question. Can you tell me when Daniel last accessed my accounts? The representative hesitated for a moment, then answered. Mrs. Carter, there have been multiple withdrawals and authorized transfers under his credentials over the past 18 months. 18 months. I felt my stomach drop. That meant this hadn't just started recently. It had been happening quietly for nearly 2 years. 2 years of Daniel smiling at me across holiday dinners. 2 years of him telling me not to worry about money. 2 years of him looking me in the eyes and saying he loved me. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not into anger, not yet. Into clarity. Because I understood something very important in that moment. If I confronted him now, he would deny everything. He would twist the truth. He would turn it into a misunderstanding. And I would never know the full story. So instead, I did something else. Something he never expected. I said nothing. I thanked the bank representative. And then I quietly began collecting evidence. Because if my son was stealing from me, I wasn't going to respond with emotion. I was going to respond with truth. And truth, when used carefully, can become the most powerful form of revenge. The first thing I did was review every financial document I had saved over the past 5 years. I kept everything, always had. Old habits from decades of managing Harold's construction business never left me. Receipts, invoices, bank statements, tax forms. They were all organized neatly in labeled folders inside a tall filing cabinet in my study. For the first 2 days, I barely left that room. I sat at my desk from morning until late at night, methodically cross-checking dates, transfers, and authorization signatures. At first, the pattern was difficult to see, but slowly, it began to emerge. The withdrawals had started shortly after Daniel convinced me to sign a financial power of attorney document. I remembered that conversation clearly. It had been the winter after Harold died. Snow piled high outside the windows, and I was struggling to manage paperwork while still grieving. Daniel had sat across from me at this very same desk. "You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone," he'd said gently. "Let me help. It's just a precaution, Mom." I trusted him completely, so I signed. And with that single signature, I gave him legal authority to manage my accounts. At the time, it felt like a practical decision. Now, I understood it had been the turning point, because within 3 months of that document being filed, the first unexplained transfer appeared. $500, then another, then larger amounts, always spaced just far enough apart that they didn't trigger suspicion. But what disturbed me most wasn't the money. It was the timing, because Daniel had always known exactly when I was emotionally vulnerable. After Harold's death, during the year, I was recovering from surgery. When I was focused on caring for my older sister during her illness, each time my attention was elsewhere, the withdrawals increased, which meant this wasn't impulsive behavior. It was calculated, deliberate, manipulative. That realization hurt more than anything, because it meant my son hadn't just taken advantage of opportunity. He had taken advantage of me. On the third night of reviewing records, I discovered something that made my hands tremble. A series of large transfers, totaling over $200,000, had been moved into an account I didn't recognize. The account holder's name was listed only as DC Holdings. Daniel Carter. He hadn't even bothered to hide it completely. He simply assumed I would never look closely enough to notice. And for years, he had been right. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Grief, shock, but also something else. Resolve. Because now I had proof, not assumptions, not suspicions. Facts. And facts, when presented correctly, cannot be argued away. That night, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would not confront Daniel privately. I would not give him a chance to manipulate the narrative. Instead, I would wait. I would gather every piece of evidence, and I would reveal the truth in a way that ensured it could never be denied. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about accountability. It was about exposing betrayal that had been hidden behind the mask of family loyalty. And I knew exactly when that moment would come. Thanksgiving dinner, the one holiday Daniel never missed, the one gathering where our entire extended family would be present. That was where the truth would finally be revealed. And when it was, it would change everything. Because betrayal thrives in silence, but once exposed in the light, it loses all its power. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of crisp November day that always reminded me of earlier years, when Harold would rake leaves while Daniel chased our old golden retriever across the yard. I woke before sunrise, unable to sleep, my mind already running through the plan I had rehearsed for weeks. Everything had to be precise, not emotional, not chaotic, precise. Because if I wanted the truth to hold its weight, it needed to be presented calmly, clearly, and with undeniable evidence. By 9 o'clock, the house smelled of roasting turkey and cinnamon. I moved through the kitchen with steady hands, chopping vegetables, stirring gravy, arranging dishes, exactly as I had every year for decades. To anyone who walked in, it would have looked like an ordinary holiday. That was the point. At 10:30, my niece Claire arrived first, carrying a pumpkin pie. She hugged me tightly, her warm energy filling the house. "You look good, Aunt Margaret," she said. "Stronger than last year." I smiled. "I am," I replied quietly, because in a strange way, I was. By noon, the house filled with voices, laughter, and the clinking of dishes. My sister Helen sat at the dining table talking about her grandchildren. Claire's husband was pouring wine in the kitchen. And then just after 12:30, Daniel walked through the front door. He looked exactly the same as always. Tall, confident, perfectly dressed in a tailored coat that probably cost more than Harold and I once spent on an entire month's groceries. He smiled when he saw me, that familiar smile, the one that used to make me feel safe. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His voice was warm, natural, as if nothing in the world was wrong. I hugged him back, forcing myself to remain steady. "Happy Thanksgiving, Daniel." For a moment, I studied his face, looking for guilt, for signs of nervousness, but there were none. He looked completely at ease, which told me something chilling. He truly believed he would never be caught. Dinner was served at 2 o'clock sharp. We gathered around the long oak table Harold had built, passing dishes, sharing small stories, laughing at old family jokes. Daniel sat to my right, casually discussing his work in corporate real estate. "I just closed a major development deal in Manhattan," he said proudly. "Luxury condos, overlooking the Hudson." Everyone congratulated him, and as I watched him speak, I noticed something subtle. A new watch on his wrist. Expensive, elegant, the kind of watch that cost tens of thousands of dollars. I felt a quiet ache in my chest, because I knew exactly where that money had come from. Halfway through the meal, Claire asked a question that shifted the conversation. "Aunt Margaret, how are your finances these days? I remember you were worried after Uncle Harold passed." The table grew slightly quieter. Daniel glanced at me quickly, just for a second. Then he returned to his calm expression. "I'm doing fine," I said gently, "though I've learned some interesting things recently." Daniel's fork paused midair, only briefly, but I noticed. "I've spent the past few months reviewing my financial records," I continued calmly. The room fell silent now. Everyone was listening. Daniel set his fork down slowly. "Mom, you didn't need to stress about that," he said lightly. "I've been handling everything." I looked directly at him. "Yes," I said quietly. "I know." Then I reached under the table and lifted a folder onto my lap. A thick folder filled with bank statements, transfer records, and authorization logs. I discovered that over the past 18 months, I said calmly, more than $200,000 was transferred from my accounts into a private holding account under your name. Daniel froze. The color drained slightly from his face. Around the table, no one spoke. I placed the documents gently on the table between us, and I think I said quietly, "You should explain why." The silence that followed was absolute, and for the first time since this began, I saw fear in my son's eyes. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He stared at the documents on the table as if they were written in a language he couldn't understand. Then he laughed, a short, forced sound that felt completely out of place in the heavy silence. "Mom," he said, shaking his head, "this is a misunderstanding." Of course it was. That was exactly what I expected him to say. I remained calm. "Then please explain it," I replied. He glanced around the table, aware that every family member was watching him closely now. "I moved funds temporarily," he said quickly, "for investment purposes, to generate higher returns for you." Claire frowned. "You never told Aunt Margaret about that." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I planned to," he said, "but things got complicated." Complicated. Such a convenient word. I opened the folder and slid a second document forward. "This is the authorization log," I said quietly. "It shows you withdrew money repeatedly for personal expenses, hotels, jewelry, airline tickets." His jaw tightened. That was business related, he insisted. Then, why I asked gently, was the account listed as your private holding company? He didn't answer immediately. Because he couldn't. The evidence left no room for excuses. My sister Helen leaned forward slowly. Daniel, she said, quietly, did you take your mother's money without telling her? He looked at her, then at me, and for a moment, his composure cracked. You don't understand, he said suddenly, his voice sharp with frustration. I needed capital to secure investment opportunities. I was going to pay it back. Going to, not had, going to. I felt something inside me settle, because that single phrase revealed everything. You never asked permission, I said quietly. I didn't think I needed to, he snapped. The room went still. I had legal authority, he continued defensively. You signed power of attorney. Yes, I said calmly. For management. Not personal enrichment, not secret transfers. Management? His eyes hardened. I did what was necessary, he said coldly. I built something valuable. That money wasn't being used anyway. The words hit harder than any denial could have. Because they revealed his true belief, that my life savings were simply idle resources waiting for him to claim. That I, his mother, was no longer a person with agency, just an asset. Claire gasped softly. Daniel, that's theft. He stood abruptly. No, he said angrily. It's family support. Parents invest in their children all the time. I met his gaze steadily. Not without consent, I said, and not in secret. The tension in the room was suffocating now. But I wasn't finished, because this confrontation was never meant to end with exposure alone. It was meant to establish accountability. I took a slow breath. 2 weeks ago, I said quietly, I met with an attorney. Daniel's eyes widened, and I filed formal documentation reporting unauthorized financial transfers under abuse of fiduciary authority. The words landed like a physical blow. That means I continued calmly. This is no longer a private family matter. Daniel stared at me stunned. You reported me. Yes, I said softly, because trust was broken long before today. For the first time in his life, my son looked truly afraid. And in that moment, he finally understood something he had never believed possible. That I was no longer protecting him. I was protecting the truth. The silence, after I told Daniel I had reported him, felt heavier than anything I had experienced since Harold's funeral. No one at the table moved. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock sounded louder than usual, echoing through the stillness. Daniel stood frozen beside his chair, staring at me as if he no longer recognized the woman sitting across from him. You wouldn't do that, he said finally, his voice low and strained. You're my mother. The words were meant to remind me of my role, to pull me back into the familiar dynamic where protecting him came before protecting myself. But something fundamental had changed inside me. Yes, I said quietly, I am your mother. And because of that, I had spent decades believing my responsibility was to shield him from consequences. Now, I understood the truth. My responsibility had always been to teach him accountability. Helen spoke first. Daniel, she said, gently but firmly, if Margaret says she filed a report, then you need to take this seriously. He looked at her sharply. You're taking her side. I'm taking the side of facts, she replied. He turned back towards me, anger flashing in his eyes now. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. This could have been handled privately. I folded my hands calmly on the table. It could have, I agreed, if you had told the truth. His jaw tightened. I told you, he said, I intended to pay it back. Intentions don't erase actions, I replied quietly. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Daniel, she said, why didn't you just ask Aunt Margaret for help if you needed money? His response came instantly. Because she would have said no. There it was. The assumption that had guided his choices, that my resources existed for him to access, regardless of my consent. That was not your decision to make, I said softly. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear in every movement. "You don't understand what it takes to build something," he said sharply. I was trying to create long-term security for both of us. The irony of his words almost made me laugh. Security built on deception is never secure. But instead of responding emotionally, I did something far more important. I reached into the folder and pulled out one final document. "This," I said quietly, sliding it toward him, "is a full financial audit conducted by my attorney." He stared at it without touching it. "It lists every unauthorized transfer." I continued along with the legal implications under fiduciary abuse laws. His face paled, because now the situation had moved beyond family conflict. It had entered legal reality. "This isn't revenge," I said calmly. "It's correction." His eyes snapped toward mine. "You call reporting your own son to the authorities correction?" "Yes," I said softly, because ignoring it would have been enabling. The room remained silent as everyone absorbed the weight of those words. Finally, Daniel pushed his chair back abruptly. "I need air," he muttered, turning toward the door. As he left the dining room, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter. Relief. Because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. And once truth is spoken, it cannot be hidden again. Daniel didn't return to the table that afternoon. He left the house without another word, his car pulling out of the driveway in a sharp burst of motion that sent dry leaves scattering across the lawn. The rest of us sat in stunned silence for a long time. No one touched their food. No one spoke. Finally, Helen reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "You did the right thing," she said gently. I nodded slowly, but the truth was more complicated than that. Because doing the right thing doesn't mean it feels easy. That night, after everyone left the house, felt painfully quiet. I washed the dishes slowly, methodically, letting the warm water run over my hands as I tried to steady my thoughts. Memories kept surfacing uninvited. Daniel as a little boy, learning to ride his bike. Daniel holding my hand on his first day of school. Daniel crying when Harold died. For decades, I had believed that love meant protecting him from harm. Now, I understood something I should have learned long ago. Love also means protecting him from becoming someone who harms others. The phone rang just after 9 that evening. I knew it would be him before I even picked it up. Mom Daniel's voice said quietly. Gone was the anger. Gone was the defensiveness. What remained was something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came quickly, as if he had rehearsed them. I didn't realize how serious this had become. I leaned against the kitchen counter, holding the phone tightly. "You knew it was serious when you took the money," I said softly. He was silent for a moment. "I thought you would never find out," he admitted. The honesty surprised me. "And once I started using the funds," he continued, "it became harder to stop. Every time I told myself I would fix it before you noticed." That was the nature of manipulation. It grows slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to undo without exposure. "There's going to be an investigation now," he said anxiously. "If this goes to court, it could destroy my career." The fear in his voice was real, but so was the truth of his situation. "I can't control the legal process anymore," I replied calmly. "That decision belongs to the authorities." He exhaled shakily. "What if I repay everything?" The question lingered between us. For years, I would have answered immediately. Of course, anything to protect him. But now, I understood something crucial. Accountability is not about repayment alone. It is about facing consequences. "You need to speak with a lawyer," I said quietly. He was silent again, and when he spoke next, his voice carried something deeper than fear. "Regret. I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I know," I replied softly. "But you did." After we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time listening to the quiet hum of the house. The path ahead would not be easy. Investigations, legal proceedings, public consequences. But beneath all of that uncertainty, I felt something steady anchoring me. Clarity. Because this confrontation was never truly about money. It was about restoring truth where deception had taken root. And once truth is restored, even painful consequences can become the beginning of something necessary, something honest, something that allows healing to begin. The investigation began faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks of my report, I received a formal letter from the Financial Crimes Division requesting a full interview. The envelope itself felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of everything that had been hidden for the past 2 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold used to drink his coffee every morning, staring at the official seal before opening it. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight in a way I couldn't fully explain. Because this was the moment when private betrayal became public reality, when family pain crossed into legal territory. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a federal office downtown. The building itself was imposing all glass and steel, designed to project authority and order. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and polished floors. A young investigator named Melissa Grant met me in a small conference room. She spoke calmly, with a professional kindness that helped ease the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "we understand this situation is emotionally difficult. Our goal is simply to establish facts." Facts. That word had become my anchor. I nodded. I understand. For nearly 2 hours, she asked detailed questions about Daniel's access to my accounts, the power of attorney documentation, and the timeline of transfers. I answered everything clearly. Not once did I raise my voice. Not once did I allow emotion to interfere with accuracy, because I knew something important. Truth is most powerful when delivered calmly. At the end of the interview, Melissa closed her folder and looked at me carefully. "There is strong evidence of fiduciary misuse," she said. "This will likely proceed to formal charges unless full restitution and legal negotiations occur." The words landed quietly, but their meaning was enormous. Formal charges, not a family dispute. A legal case. I nodded slowly. "Thank you," I said. When I stepped outside the building into the cold afternoon air, the city felt strangely distant, as if I were watching everything through a thin layer of glass. For years, my world had revolved around family. Now that same family had become part of a legal process. It was a painful realization, but also, in an unexpected way, a freeing one, because the burden of handling this alone was no longer mine. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded tired. "I met with an attorney," he said. I waited quietly. "He says, if I cooperate fully and repay everything, there's a chance to avoid criminal charges." There was a long pause. "Mom," he continued softly, "I don't know how I became someone capable of this." His question lingered in the silence between us, and for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a single bad decision. It was the result of years of entitlement left unchallenged. "You became this," I said gently, "when you started believing that access meant ownership." He didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the city in quiet layers of snow that softened the harsh edges of everything. Christmas decorations appeared in neighborhood windows, but inside my home, the atmosphere felt more subdued than it had in decades. Not sad, just reflective. Daniel visited for the first time since Thanksgiving, 3 weeks before Christmas. He stood at the door, holding a plain envelope, his posture uncertain in a way I had never seen before. He looked thinner, older somehow. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside. He walked slowly into the living room, his eyes moving across familiar furniture photographs and the small Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner. "I brought something," he said, holding out the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Full repayment, every dollar that had been taken. I stared at it for a long moment, not because I doubted its authenticity, but because of what it represented. Not forgiveness, not resolution, accountability. I sold the Manhattan investment, he explained quietly, and liquidated everything else. His voice trembled slightly. It's all here. I nodded slowly and set the envelope on the table without opening it. Thank you, I said. He sat down heavily on the sofa, his shoulders sagging. The lawyer says cooperation might keep this from going to trial, he said. But my reputation, my career, they're already damaged. I studied his face. For years, he had projected absolute confidence. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by something more human, fear, regret, and humility. I spent so long chasing success, he said quietly, that I forgot the difference between earning and taking. The admission hung in the air. I don't expect you to trust me again, he continued, but I needed to tell you, I finally understand what I did. His words were not dramatic, not rehearsed. They were simple, and because of that, they felt real. I sat across from him, the soft glow of Christmas lights reflecting between us. Trust, I said gently, is not rebuilt through words. He nodded slowly. I know. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that surprised me. Do you still love me? The vulnerability in his voice pierced something deep inside me. Yeah, I said quietly. I always will. He looked down, tears finally forming in his eyes. But love, I continued softly, does not mean protection from consequences. He nodded again, because now he understood something he had never fully grasped before. That love without accountability is not love. It is permission, and permission had allowed this betrayal to grow for far too long. As he left that evening, I watched him walk slowly down the driveway, his shoulders heavy, but his steps steady. For the first time in years, I saw him not as the confident executive he had tried to become, but as a man finally facing the truth of his own actions. And that realization, painful as it was, marked the beginning of something new. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the possibility of it. Because sometimes true change begins only after everything false has been stripped away. January arrived with a bitter cold that settled into the bones of the house, the kind of deep winter stillness that made every sound feel sharper and more deliberate. By then, the legal process had moved into its final phase. Daniel's attorney negotiated continuously, with the Financial Crimes Division presenting documentation of full restitution, voluntary cooperation, and his clean legal record prior to this incident. I received periodic updates through formal letters, each one written in the detached language of legal procedure. But beneath those formal words, the reality remained clear. My son's future now depended not on family forgiveness, but on institutional judgment, and that distinction changed everything. One morning, I received a call from investigator Melissa Grant. Mrs. Carter, she said gently, I wanted to inform you personally that the prosecutor has agreed to a deferred prosecution arrangement. I held the phone tightly. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she explained, that Mr. Carter will avoid criminal charges if he complies with strict financial monitoring, professional ethics training, and a multi-year probation agreement. A long breath left my chest. Not relief exactly, but something close, because the outcome balanced accountability with the possibility of redemption. He will also permanently lose access to fiduciary authority over personal financial accounts, she added. That detail carried profound symbolic weight. The legal system had formally removed the very power he had once misused. Thank you for letting me know, I said quietly. After the call ended, I sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the finality of what had happened. The confrontation that began with a bank statement had ended with legal intervention and institutional oversight. But beneath the legal resolution lay something deeper, a shift in understanding, because this process had not simply corrected financial wrongdoing. It had forced both of us to confront the emotional patterns that allowed it to happen. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded steadier than it had in months. "The agreement was finalized today," he said. "I know," I replied. There was a pause. "I'll be under supervision for several years," he continued, "and I'm stepping down from my executive position." The admission carried quiet humility. "That must be difficult," I said gently. "It is," he admitted, "but it's also clarifying." I understood what he meant, because sometimes losing status reveals what truly matters. "I'm starting consulting work on a smaller scale," he said. "Nothing flashy, just rebuilding honestly." Rebuilding. The word lingered in the air, because that was exactly what both of us had been doing, in different ways. Spring arrived slowly that year, bringing with it a softening of everything that had once felt rigid and broken. The snow melted, trees regained their leaves, and with each passing week, the emotional distance between Daniel and me began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. He visited more often now, usually on quiet Sunday afternoons. We spoke about ordinary things, work, books, memories of Harold. We did not revisit the legal case. There was no need, because the truth had already been acknowledged. One afternoon in early May, Daniel arrived carrying a small wooden box. "I found this while going through Dad's old workshop tools," he said. I opened the box slowly. Inside was Harold's original business ledger, the one he had kept during the early years when his construction company was struggling to survive. I ran my fingers gently over the worn leather cover. "He wrote in this every night," I whispered. Daniel nodded. "I read some of his notes," he said quietly. I looked up at him. "What did you think?" He hesitated. "He recorded every expense carefully," he said, "even small amounts. He believed accountability was the foundation of trust." The words settled deeply between us, because they revealed something simple but profound. Daniel had not only repaid the money, he had begun to understand the values he had once overlooked. "I wish I had paid more attention to his example earlier," he said softly. "It's not too late," I replied. He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "it isn't." That moment marked a quiet turning point. Not forgiveness, not full restoration, but something more sustainable, mutual honesty. Because true reconciliation is not built on forgetting the past. It is built on understanding it. As we sat together in the warm spring sunlight, filtering through the living room windows, I felt something settle inside me that I had not felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from avoiding conflict, but the kind that comes from facing it fully. Because the truth once revealed has a way of clearing space for something new, something healthier, something real. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destruction. It is transformation, both of oneself and of the relationship that once seemed beyond repair. By the time autumn returned, the house no longer felt heavy with silence the way it had the year before. The air carried that familiar scent of dry leaves and wood smoke drifting from neighbors' fireplaces. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows in warm, golden strips, the same way it always had when Harold was alive. But something inside me had changed, not in a dramatic way, in a steady one, because I no longer lived with the quiet anxiety that had once lingered beneath every interaction with Daniel. For the first time in years, our conversations were simple, honest, without hidden expectations. One Sunday afternoon in October, Daniel arrived earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway, holding a small paper bag from a local bakery. "I brought cinnamon rolls," he said, with a faint smile. I stepped aside to let him in. He moved through the house, slowly pausing briefly in the living room, where Harold's framed photograph rested on the mantel. "I think about him a lot now," he said quietly. I followed his gaze. So do I replied. He nodded. I used to think his way of living was small, he admitted. Careful, conservative. There was no defensiveness in his voice now, only reflection. But now I understand something, he continued. He wasn't small. He was grounded. The word lingered between us. Grounded, because that was exactly what Daniel had lacked during the years he had chased status and expansion without limits. We sat together at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and the cinnamon rolls he had brought. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the neighborhood, a new community program he had started volunteering with helping older residents manage financial paperwork. That detail caught my attention. You're volunteering? I asked gently. He nodded. It's part of my probation requirements, he said. But it's also meaningful. He hesitated before continuing. I meet people who trust their families completely, just like you trusted me. His voice softened, and I finally understand how fragile that trust really is. I reached across the table and placed my hand lightly over his. Understanding that I said quietly is how trust begins to grow again. He looked at me, his eyes steady. I know it will take years, he said. Yes, I replied, but time is not something we need to fear anymore. Because now there was no deception standing between us. No hidden accounts, no unspoken truths, just reality. And reality, even when painful, is far easier to live with than uncertainty. As the afternoon light faded and Daniel prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Thank you, he said softly. For what I asked, for not protecting me from consequences, he answered. The words settled deeply inside me because they confirmed something I had come to understand through this entire journey. True love is not about shielding someone from accountability. It is about giving them the opportunity to become better. And sometimes that opportunity only appears after everything false has been stripped away. Thanksgiving came again, 1 year after the day everything had changed. This time, the house felt different. Not tense, not fragile, just calm. The long oak dining table Harold built was once again filled with family. Helen sat at the end, telling stories. Claire's children laughed as they helped set the table. Daniel arrived early, carrying a simple bouquet of autumn flowers. He placed them quietly in the center of the table before coming to stand beside me in the kitchen. I still remember last Thanksgiving, he said softly. So do I replied. But the memory no longer felt sharp. It felt distant, like a storm that had passed, leaving the air clearer afterward. Dinner unfolded peacefully. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter returned in a way that felt genuine rather than forced. At one point, Claire raised her glass. To family, she said, and to honesty. Everyone nodded, because now, honesty was no longer something fragile. It was something solid, something earned. After the meal, as the house quieted and guests began to leave, Daniel lingered in the living room. He looked around slowly, taking in the familiar space. I used to think success meant having control over everything, he said quietly. I sat beside him, and now I asked. He smiled faintly. Now I think it means being worthy of trust. The simplicity of his answer touched something deep inside me. Because trust once broken cannot be restored through promises, only through consistent truth over time. Later that evening, after he left, I sat alone by the kitchen window, watching the last light of the day fade across the yard. The journey from betrayal to accountability had not been easy. It had required painful decisions, hard confrontations, and the willingness to let truth take its course, even when that truth threatened to fracture the family forever. But in the end, something unexpected had emerged. Not revenge in the traditional sense, not punishment alone, but balance. Because sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is not destroying someone. It is allowing them to face the consequences of their actions so fully that they are forced to change. It is reclaiming your dignity without losing compassion. It is choosing truth over silence. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever faced betrayal, family conflict, or the difficult process of holding someone accountable while still loving them, I would love to hear from you. Tell me where you are listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about karma, emotional justice, and the quiet strength of truth, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us that even after betrayal, healing is still possible.